is not one of those. In a psychological context, moods are pretty much exactly what you think they are. Emotional states that are even more subjective and harder to define than the emotions themselves. And while psychologists have defined about 10 basic emotions, moods tend to fall into two broadly and infinitely variable categories. You got the good moods and the bad moods. Probably the most important distinction between emotion and mood is that moods are long-term emotional states rather than discrete, fleeting feelings. And mood disorders, which are characterized by emotional extremes and challenges in regulating mood, tend to be longer-term disturbances. These include depressive disorders typified by prolonged hopelessness and lethargy, and bipolar disorders, the most prominent of which involve alternating between depression and mania. Depression's been called the common cold of psychological disorders, which is not to say that it isn't serious, but it's common and it's pervasive and it's the top reason people seek out mental health help. We've all felt down before, obviously often in response to a specific loss, a breakup or a lost job or the death of a loved one. And the fact is you probably should feel bad at times like those. It can actually be good for a mind and body to slow down to help digest losses that you experience, but in general, sadness is temporary. It's when sadness and grief extend beyond the generally accepted social norms or plunge into a depth that causes serious dysfunction that you find yourself in the territory of depressive disorders. The DSM-5, our handy if super flawed user's guide to psychological disorders, officially diagnoses a major depressive disorder when a patient has experienced at least 5 signs of depression for more than 2 weeks. These symptoms include not just depressed mood, but also significant weight or appetite loss or gain, too much or too little sleep, decreased interest in activities, feeling worthless, fatigued, or lethargic, difficulty concentrating or making decisions, and recurrent thoughts of death or suicide. So while everyone experiences sadness, depression is a physiological as well as psychological illness. It messes with your sleep and appetite and energy and neurotransmitter levels, all interfering with the way your body runs itself. Plus, in keeping with our definition of psychological disorders to be considered a true disorder, this behavior needs to cause the person or others around them prolonged distress, the feeling that something is really wrong. Just as a person with severe generalized anxiety disorder may never want to leave the house, a clinically depressed person often feels so hopeless and overwhelmed that they have trouble living a normal life. And unlike the bipolar disorders, the depressive disorders tend to be all lows. Like so many things in psychology, the cause of mood disorders is often a combination of biological, genetic, psychological, and environmental factors. We know, for example, that mood disorders run in families. Genes matter, and you're more likely to experience a bipolar or depressive disorder if you have parents or siblings who suffer from them. Studies of identical twins show that if one twin has a bipolar disorder, that the other has a 7 in 10 chance of also being diagnosed, regardless of whether they were raised together or apart. And while a stressful life can't give you bipolar disorder, it could trigger a manic or depressive episode in someone with a pre-existing condition, or start a descent into a major depressive episode in someone who'd never before experienced depression. In other words, a person who loses a loved one could go from sad to depressed, or slide into a bipolar episode, but it couldn't cause them to have the disorder to begin with. In the case of depressive disorders, for most people, after weeks, months, or even years, their depression can end, hopefully with a return to baseline healthy functioning. Worldwide, women tend to be diagnosed with major depression more often than men, but many psychologists think this is simply because women tend to seek treatment more. It's also possible that depression in men tends to manifest itself more in terms of anger and aggression than as sadness and hopelessness. This is just an example of how depression is much more than just being sad, and that the characteristic lack of purpose and hopelessness can manifest itself in a lot of different ways. People with depression often view bad events through an internal lens or mindset that influences how they're interpreted, and how you explain events to yourself in a negative or positive way can really affect how you recover from them, or don't. Say you were humiliated in the lunchroom when someone tripped you and your chicken soup flew all over the place, and you sat down on a brownie and it was just a bad day. A depressive mind might immediately start thinking that the humiliation will last forever, that no one will ever let you live it down, that it's somehow your own fault, and you can't ever do anything right. That negative thinking, learned helplessness, self-blame, and overthinking can feed off itself and basically smother the joy out of a brain, eventually creating a vicious, self-fulfilling cycle of negative thinking. The good news is that that cycle can be broken by getting help from a professional, turning your attention outward, doing more fun things, maybe even moving to a different environment. But again, that social cognitive perspective is just part of a much bigger puzzle. Positive thinking is important, but it's often inadequate on its own when up against genetic or neurological factors.